What we're going to talk about with Grant Newsham next, as part of our continuing big picture coverage, is what China has in mind for Taiwan, a vital ally of the United States in a very important strategic position there. And Grant has been studying this closely, writing copiously on it, and informing, I think, people at the highest levels of the United States government about what we need to do to assure that China is discouraged, if not actually permanently deterred from acting on its ambitions towards Taiwan. Grant Newsham, again, it's good to have you with us, and thank you for all that you do to help raise awareness about the challenges we're facing here in the United States, but in the region and beyond, in Asia, at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Let me ask you to just start with that last point. The Chinese endlessly talk about, and have for decades, the reunification of Taiwan with the mainland. What is the historic truth about the connection between this island of Taiwan and the Chinese mainland? And how does this narrative play into the sort of efforts to normalize and legitimate even perhaps the violent conquest of Taiwan?
Well, it's about as good as the claim that America has to Bermuda, ultimately. It differs in the specifics a bit, but the Chinese communists have never had Taiwan. And during all of Chinese history, there was about a 10-year period during the Qing dynasty, which was in the 1800s, when they had the most tenuous marginal control of the place. Otherwise, it has never been part of China, and it's certainly never been part of communist China. But they use that word reunification, and you hear the Western elites, the academics, and even politicians, and people should know better. Yes. They use the expression too, as if it was once part of China, but it never has been. And once again, it's a way that you can shape people's thinking to where they think, well, the China just wants what belongs to it, let them have it. And it's a very sort of subtle, sinister approach to things, but it's had some effect. So, but when the Chinese...
This is part of the psychological and information warfare that the Chinese, of course, have specialized in. And as you say, if you want to think that this is too hard to try to prevent the Chinese from having their way, it's a way to rationalize why it is legitimate for them to do it. So talk a little bit about the Chinese preparations. We've spoken about unrestricted warfare, how that has been manifesting, but also the increasing capability of the Chinese to actually exercise a military option, should they choose to do so.
Yes, China has been building up their military for decades, but particularly for about the last 20 years. They've been building it up so that it can seize Taiwan, and that it can also take on the Americans, to keep the Americans from getting involved in this. And they have undergone the biggest, fastest defense buildup probably in history. And they have now got a military that could think that it has a reasonable chance of invading Taiwan and winning. And so they could get across the strait, the Taiwan Strait. Everyone imagines this amphibious invasion like D-Day. And that is part of the equation, but it's going to take place in the context of missiles raining out of the skies and hitting what they're supposed to, of Chinese jets all dominating the airspace, Chinese ships and submarines. Fifth columnists already in Taiwan go to work and cause confusion. Cyber attacks, electronic warfare. So the airborne operations, part of it too, special forces operations. So it isn't just this amphibious assault. It's a much sort of multifaceted attack. And that's just the military part. And there's obviously, we've talked about earlier, is the psychological assault on Taiwan. and to wear it down, to make the population think, well, there's no alternative to this, that the Americans aren't going to help you, they can't help you. And then you work on the business class, the political class. There's every country has its share of quislings, of traitors, basically, who would sell out the place. And the business class, well, they have their own unique characteristics, which value money over patriotism too often. So China has been working on Taiwan for a long, long time, and now they've got to the point they think, well, the military part of it just might work.
Mm-hmm. And one of the great ironies, of course, is that under the Kuomintang, which was the Chinese nationalist party and force that came to Taiwan after losing the Civil War, have gotten to the point where they were actually, when in government in recent years, promoting ties with China and business investments, not least, and the movement of technologies, including, of course, their highly developed silicon chip manufacturing capabilities. So some of this is something that they brought on themselves in terms of those quislings or compromised elites. But it's also something that the Chinese, of course, have worked hard to cultivate. One of the things that I'm always impressed by as very experienced military men is your understanding of the extent to which the Chinese have built not only these kinds of capabilities, these multifaceted, one might say, whole of society capabilities to accomplish the objective of taking Taiwan, but they've created them in a way, and they've positioned them in a way, and they exercise them in a way that it could create essentially a no warning or minimal warning that an operation to take the place is afoot. Talk a little bit about that, how they've gone about it, and the degree to which the kinds of warnings and indicators, as they call them in the military and intelligence sectors, might not be present as we would like.
Yeah,
especially if we have to get there before it happens, ideally.
I'm afraid that the Chinese have built up a capability to do a no-notice attack on Taiwan. Because on our side, the American side, we've always thought, well, we'll see these transport ships being brought into harbors on the eastern coast of China. You're going to see aircraft flying into all these bases that they've got.
The littoral
so
areas.
We'll get these signs that they're going to make a move, but I'm not sure that we will. I think they do have the things in place to make the move, and you could even disguise it as part of some other regular training, etc. So I think our assumptions are mistaken, that we're going to have months of advance notice, and therefore we can talk the Chinese out of this, so that we can get our forces in position. But I'm not so sure of that. I think that's a bad bet to make these days.
Yeah, I do too, especially since the Chinese are not fools. There's every incentive for them to both disguise their intentions and deflect our interest from them.
Yeah, I wish they were fools, but they're not.
No, sadly.
It's funny that you have the Korean War with when the Chinese went into Korea. The Americans refused to see what was coming.
Right.
But deception is always a part of the Chinese strategy, not just the communists. And it's often pretty effective.
Yes,
so I'd be concerned here.
Art of war, I think, is what Sun Tzu called it. So, Grant, when you look at their calculations, the Chinese Communist Party's leadership's calculations about whether to go for it or not, one thing that is clearly missing is the kind of actual first-hand experience of having done these kinds of massive amphibious operations. Another calculation is whether they think we would actually come to the rescue, or at least become engaged in a way that would complicate their operational plan, their attack. How do they see us at the moment in terms of interposing the kinds of force that would make this mission much more challenging, if not really problematic?
I think they see the Americans as a huge problem, but it's a problem that's getting smaller and less as the Chinese capabilities develop, particularly long-range ballistic missiles that can hit ships moving at sea, which means our aircraft carriers are potentially targets. And the Chinese see things as trending in their direction. I think they may think that they've got the advantage, particularly if you can get enough Americans in the sort of that elite class to think it's not worth it. It's not worth risking nuclear war over 24 million people on this little island. If they can get that political warfare part of the equation right, I think they really like their odds. But when you look at this from a Chinese perspective, the upside is considerable. If you can take Taiwan, one, you have breached the so-called first island chain, this string of islands from Japan down to the Philippines, Taiwan, Malaysia, that effectively hems in the Chinese military. Take Taiwan and you breach the defenses. You can get into the you can get to the Western Pacific freely now. You can get up and surround Taiwan. Surround Japan, and you can cut the sea lanes through the South China Sea easily. And that's where most of Japan and Korea's oil comes from. Indeed. But also think of the psychological, political message. You took Taiwan. The American military couldn't prevent it. America's financial and economic threats against and pressure against China had no effect, and American nuclear weapons were useless. So if you're some other country in Asia or anywhere else, you may be thinking,
time for a separate peace.
Or, let's cut the best deal we can.
Yes,
so from China's perspective, the upside may look tempting.
Yeah. Especially if, as I understand, there are other factors operating inside China itself that might precipitate what's, I guess, been characterized as a favorite totalitarian playbook option, which is social engineering, create a foreign threat or event that gets everybody rallying around the flag. So we've got a situation in which the United States could see itself, especially in the aftermath of the Afghan debacle, the humiliating surrender by the Biden administration, that further reinforces this sense that, on the one hand, China can pull this off, and on the other, for the Taiwanese and others in the region, they better just recognize the new reality that China is their overlord. One of the other places in which we might see these kinds of calculations operating, Grant, we talked about it in an earlier segment with you at some length, but I want to come back to it against the backdrop of something that's happening here in the United States at the moment. And that is the efforts by the Chinese to dominate South Korea. Obviously, it currently dominates North Korea, but another of our key allies is in serious jeopardy, it seems to me, both from the immediate threat of the North Koreans themselves, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about that, but also from the Chinese and their unrestricted warfare. Give us just a quick recap of what the order of battle is on the Korean Peninsula and how dangerous it could become for freedom-loving people there if these forces, China on the one hand, North Korea on the other, turn their malevolent intentions loose again.
Well, you've got North Korea that has a very considerable conventional capability. If North Korea wanted to push south, they could cause us a lot of problems. But also, as we know, North Korea is developing nuclear weapons and delivery systems, long-range missiles that you can put the nuclear weapons on and shoot them at Japan, at U.S. territory, at South Korea, of course. So North Korea, in its own right, is a formidable force. In China's perspective, what they're happy to have the Korean Peninsula as a distraction for America. Because how many times have you heard, well, we can't be hard on China because we need their help solving the North Korea problem. And that has hamstrung us
than I can stand,
for decades.
Yeah,
and
it's true.
So there's that angle, that they're glad to have it as a distraction. But China also doesn't like having American troops in South Korea. And China would prefer to have Korea unified, but really under northern control, and with China dominating the whole thing. But to do that, you've got to get American troops off the peninsula. And that's where Chinese interest in South Korean domestic politics comes into play, because they've definitely got a favorite in this. And if you have...
favored in the sense of the political leadership of South Korea, currently in the person of Moon Jae-in, the president of South Korea. You've done some fascinating research into the degree to which the Chinese and the Moon government itself may have been involved in election irregularities, as it's rather understatedly called, theft of elections, specifically in the parliament in 2020. How does that factor into the kind of political warfare you're referring to here?
Well, first on that question of electoral irregularities, that was the 2020 National Assembly elections in South Korea. And I'd had occasion to take a very deep look into this, and I was really skeptical that anything happened. But having looked into it, I think it did.
Unmistakable.
And you look at it from China's perspective. If you can have a favorably inclined administration in South Korea, or one that isn't favorably inclined to you, well, which one do you want? Mm-hmm. And particularly if you can get them into office and you put them with an overwhelming majority, that they can change the constitution, they can suppress any opposition, get the media thoroughly cowed, bring the military under control. Well, you've got permanent sort of pro-China party for a long time, and that it would be a pretty good motivation for them. But we do have an election upcoming in South Korea next year for president, and that's going to be an important one.
Your assessment of the successor in Moon's own party is pretty chilling. Talk a little bit about that individual and his attitude on these very important issues, specifically reunification with the North on the North's terms.
These guys, really, when you just listen to what they say, and it is troubling, given our relationship with South Korea, given the extent to which most South Koreans value the U.S. relationship, value the military presence. But these people come straight out and say the Americans shouldn't be here. We don't really think the U.S.-Korea alliance should continue. Maybe it should, maybe it shouldn't. They say the UN command is useless. There's no point to have it here. That we want to get rid of sanctions against North Korea. We want the Americans to declare the end of the Korean War, to sign a treaty. And they don't say it out loud, but they mean sign the treaty and go home. And so these are people, so if you just look at what they say, and it should give anyone, say in the U.S. government or even in that part of the South Korean populace that does value their freedom, it should give them real concern.
Pause, for sure. When you look at the techniques that the Chinese and their proxies in North Korea have utilized extensively, again, as part of this sort of effort to use unrestricted warfare to advance their ends. We've talked a bit about political warfare as a component of that, but talk specifically about something called the United Front Work Department in China, and I guess it's the United Front Department in North Korea. What role does that play, specifically with respect to South Korea?
What you have is this United Front Works Department. You consider it as the international propaganda and subversion arm of the Chinese Communist Party. And it's to go and make friends, to subvert and sort of lure in.
Co-opt, suborn.
There's probably a dozen words.
Buy off.
But that's what it is. Yeah. You're trying to get these groups and people in other countries to sort of line up with the Chinese Communist Party, to see it's, they're not a threat, that we're all just trying to get along. And they're incredibly successful at it. And
these are not necessarily people who are leftists themselves, aligned with them. They may be people who have, an understandable desire for peace and to be seen as promoting it, but it seems as though it's a pretty comprehensive effort to, as I say, suborn any comer that might be useful to them. No,
it really is, and you're seeing it in the South, in terms of South Korean affairs. You're seeing it particularly in the United States, where you have this push by sort of peace activists. Many of them, these are American peace activists with ties to South Korean leftists and to North Korea. And
it's hard to believe.
No, that is.
It's operating.
In fact, it's funny. I've heard that one North Korean official at the UN who deals with these people, he actually described one of them as too extreme. But what you do is you push this idea of let's just sue for peace. All we need is an agreement. You don't even if you can't sign an agreement, just announce America thinks the war is ended. And it's all very alluring, because if we talk, we're going to get to know each other. We can work things out.
Nobel Peace Prizes.
So if you're some U.S. congressman, that you may see this and think, well, everybody wants peace. It doesn't hurt to talk. It doesn't hurt if we make the first move just to jumpstart this better relationship. And this, once again, despite 30 years of trying this, and it's completely failed, and there's no reason why a move like this would work this time any more than when Charlie Brown kicks that football Lucy has got, and she pulls it away. And what is our latest sort of move in this towards this direction is something called H.R. 3446. It's a bill that's been put into Congress. And
Peace on the Korean Peninsula.
Well, who could be against that?
Needless
but
to say.
What it calls for is sort of serious, urgent negotiations to reach a deal, a peace agreement with the North Koreans, and to set up liaison offices in Pyongyang and in Washington, and to make it easier for Korean Americans to visit their relatives in North Korea. So all of these things, they sound unobjectionable. But of course, everybody wants peace, and what's wrong with relatives meeting each other? And if you put in liaison offices, we get to know each other.
Dialogue.
And, there isn't a shred of evidence that any of this will work. We've tried for 30 years to reach a deal with North Korea. It kind of helps if North Korea wants to reach a deal. The liaison offices, that's the one step removed from diplomatic recognition. Do that, and Kim, the North Korean dictator, says, well, look, I did nothing. And look, the Americans have backed off. And so this bill is in Congress, and it's got some co-sponsors. Not a ton of them, but this bill, is it's a successor of other bills, and there will be future ones. But it's this push to have the Americans rush into a peace agreement. You think we'd know something of the dangers of that after Vietnam when we did that, after Afghanistan.
Henry Kissinger turns up again in the mix. Did he not? Yeah.
But also, another thing is, if you sign an agreement, or even if America announces we think the state of hostilities is over, at that point you have just said, well, there's no need for Americans to be on the peninsula. And that is where the next push will come.
And this is not speculation, Grant. This is the stated intent of the Moon government, as I understand it. It's obviously the desire of the North Korean government, and for that matter, the Chinese. As you said, everybody seems to have an interest in the United States being off the peninsula, except the people of South Korea.
And it is a bill that it's almost as if it was written in Pyongyang and Beijing.
And probably was, quite frankly.
Well, I think some of the advice did
Certainly
come from
the drafting might have taken place there. So just again, from the perspective of a military man, if the United States were, in fact, to withdraw these forces that have kept the peace unmistakably for 30-odd years, longer now, what would likely ensue, as you see it?
Well, I would see the real possibility of North Korea stepping up its pressure on South Korea with, say, threatening missile launches, and the possibility of an all-out attack. You cannot sort of dismiss that. But you also would find China applying pressure on the peninsula. It could be economic pressure, sort of psychological pressure, political pressure on any South Korean administration, leftist or conservative. But China would really step up, the pressure. And once you've done that, you've also, once again, the Americans have humiliated themselves.
Yes, indeed.
And they've removed themselves from some strategic terrain, and they've showed that, they're not interested.
Right.
And if they're not interested there, they're probably not interested anywhere else.
Right.
So,
especially how significant our strategic interests are in this particular country. Grant, we have to leave it at that for the moment. We will continue this conversation with you, I hope, in the days to come, and thank you for your expertise and insights. And thanks to all of you for joining us for this edition of The Big Picture. It is our privilege to bring you information we think you really need to know, because after all, the dangers we're talking about are not confined to the Far East. They're very much aimed at us as well. We hope that you'll be better equipped to contend with them, and tune in for more of The Big Picture. For all of us here, this is Frank Gaffney. Thanks for being with us.